The most expensive shortcut in Texas finally came due. At 6:12 on a Tuesday morning, I locked a steel gate on my 800-acre ranch. 8 minutes later, dozens of vehicles were trapped behind it. An HOA president was screaming into her phone, and a sheriff was on his way. The strange part? I wasn't worried, because while everyone in Silver Creek Estates believed that road belonged to them, I had a folder full of documents saying otherwise. What started as one locked gate uncovered 8 years of assumptions, hidden warnings, and a truth nobody wanted homeowners to see. And by the time it was over, the people calling the cops wished they'd checked the paperwork first. If you enjoy stories about standing your ground, property rights, and watching the truth come to light one document at a time, take a second to subscribe and join us for more HOA and ranch stories, just like this one. I locked the gate at exactly 6:12 on a Tuesday morning. The chain rattled once as I pulled it tight through the steel bars. The padlock clicked shut, and just like that, 8 years of assumptions came to an end. I stood there for a moment with my coffee in one hand, looking down the gravel road that cut through my ranch. It stretched nearly a mile across my property before disappearing behind a ridge and connecting to Silver Creek Estates, a neighborhood of expensive homes built on land that used to be cattle pasture. The first vehicle showed up 4 minutes later. A white landscaping truck rounded the bend, rolled toward the gate, then slammed on its brakes hard enough to throw dust across the fence line. The driver stared. Then he stared again, like the gate wasn't supposed to exist. By 6:20, the road looked like a parking lot. Pickup trucks, school SUVs, contractors hauling trailers, a delivery van with blinking hazard lights. Vehicles stacked bumper to bumper all the way back toward the subdivision entrance. Some drivers got out. Some made phone calls. Others just stood there looking confused. Nobody seemed angry yet. Mostly shocked, which told me everything I needed to know. Not one of them had ever questioned whether they were supposed to be using this road. For years, they'd simply been told it belonged to them. The sound of tires crunching gravel echoed again. This time I knew exactly who it was before the vehicle came into view. A white Cadillac Escalade flew around the curve faster than it should have. The SUV stopped sideways near the gate. The driver's door swung open, and Denise Holloway stepped out. Even from 50 feet away, she looked furious. She marched straight toward me, carrying a leather folder under one arm and a phone in the other. Her sunglasses reflected the morning sun. Her heels dug into ranch dirt that technically belonged to me. Open it. No greeting. No question. Just a command. I took a sip of coffee. Morning, Denise. Her jaw tightened. Open the gate. No. The crowd behind her began paying attention. Conversations stopped. A few people moved closer. Denise pointed toward the traffic jam. You can't block access to an entire community. I glanced behind her. Looks blocked to me. Several residents exchanged nervous looks. Denise wasn't used to resistance. For years, she'd spoken with the confidence of someone who expected every sentence to become reality. This morning, reality wasn't cooperating. That road serves hundreds of homeowners. It crosses my ranch. It serves the community. It crosses my ranch. Her face reddened. People need to get to work. I shrugged. They should probably use a road they actually own. That got a reaction. Not from Denise. From the crowd. Murmurs spread through the line of waiting residents. People started looking at one another. Questions appeared on faces that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. Denise noticed it too, and she immediately shifted tactics. She raised her voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. This road has been used for years. I nodded. That's true. You can't suddenly change the rules. Funny thing about property rights, I said. They're not determined by popularity. A contractor near the front laughed before catching himself. Denise shot him a look. The laugh disappeared. Then she pulled out her phone. Good. I'd been waiting for that. I'm calling the sheriff. She said it like she'd just delivered a winning move. Several residents visibly relaxed. Apparently, they expected law enforcement to solve the problem for them. I simply leaned against the fence. Go ahead. She made the call, and while she talked, I watched the crowd. Some looked annoyed. Some looked worried. A few looked genuinely confused. Those were the ones I felt sorry for. Most of them had bought homes believing what they'd been told. None of them knew the story behind the road. Not yet. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's unit appeared on the county road. The vehicle rolled through the dust and stopped beside the gate. Sheriff Luke Tanner stepped out. Tall, calm, gray at the temples. The kind of man who never rushed because he never had to. The crowd immediately started talking. Everyone wanted his attention. Everyone except me. Sheriff Tanner held up one hand. The noise stopped. Then he walked toward the gate. First he looked at Denise. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the lock. The silence stretched. Denise jumped in immediately. Sheriff, thank goodness you're here. He nodded politely. She launched into a speech. Community access, property values, emergency services, traffic disruption, neighborhood rights. The words came fast, like she was trying to overwhelm the situation before facts could catch up. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When she finally stopped talking, he turned toward me. Morning, Wyatt. Morning. Then he asked a question that instantly changed the mood of the entire crowd. Still have your documents? I smiled, because that wasn't the question Denise expected, and judging by the look on her face, she knew it. I reached into my truck, pulled out a weathered brown folder, and handed it to him. The sheriff opened it, flipped through several pages. Survey maps, county records, property documents, the same paperwork I'd spent months organizing. He studied them quietly, then closed the folder, handed it back, and turned toward Denise. The crowd leaned forward, waiting. Sheriff Tanner adjusted his hat, then said the one thing nobody wanted to hear. Ma'am, this gate sits on Wyatt Mercer's property. The entire road went silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the engines seemed quieter. Denise stared at him, blinking, trying to process what she'd just heard. Then she recovered. Fast. Too fast. This road belongs to the community. The sheriff shook his head. No, ma'am. She pointed toward the traffic. People have used it for years. His expression never changed. Using a road and owning a road aren't the same thing. That landed harder than any argument could have. The crowd felt it. I could see it happening. For the first time all morning, people stopped looking at me and started looking at Denise. Questions were forming. Dangerous questions. The kind she'd spent years avoiding. I took one final sip of coffee, then looked down the road stretching through my ranch. The same road everyone thought they understood. You've all been driving through my property for years, I said. The crowd watched. Today you start asking permission. Nobody answered, because hanging over the entire scene was one question nobody could explain. If the road belonged to me, why had everyone been told it belonged to them? And judging by the nervous look that flashed across Denise Holloway's face, she already knew the answer. The strange part was, I wouldn't understand why until much later. 2 years earlier, none of this had been on my radar. Back then, I was standing in a probate attorney's office in Austin, staring at a stack of documents that officially made me the owner of 800 acres of Texas ranch land. Most people hear something like that and think lottery ticket. I didn't. I thought responsibility. The ranch had belonged to my father for nearly 40 years. Before that, it belonged to my grandfather. Every fence line, stock pond, and cattle trail carried somebody's fingerprints. And now it was mine. The attorney slid the final deed across the table. "Everything's transferred, Mr. Mercer." I signed. Just like that. The last chapter of my father's life became the first chapter of a problem I didn't even know existed. 3 weeks later, I drove through the ranch entrance for the first time as owner. The steel gate looked exactly the way I remembered from childhood. The gravel road stretched across rolling pasture toward the hills. Nothing seemed different. Then a plumbing van drove past me, not on the county road, on my ranch road. I frowned. A few minutes later, another vehicle appeared. Then another. Then another. By noon, I'd counted nearly 40. Delivery trucks, landscapers, contractors, luxury SUVs, everyone using the road like it was public property. At first, I assumed there was some agreement. My father had always been practical. If neighbors needed temporary access, he usually found a solution. But after 3 days of watching constant traffic, something felt wrong. Nobody slowed down. Nobody waved. Nobody asked permission. They drove through my property with the confidence of people who believed they belonged there. So I followed the road. 3/4 of a mile later, it curved around a stand of cedar trees and opened into something I had never seen before. A subdivision, large homes, stone entry monuments, perfect landscaping, decorative streetlights, a neighborhood called Silver Creek Estates. I parked near the entrance. A man walking his dog nodded politely. "Beautiful community," he said. "How long's it been here?" I asked. "About 8 years." He pointed behind me. "Best entrance road in the county." The road. My road. I thanked him and drove away. The conversation bothered me the entire trip home. Not because he'd done anything wrong, because he sounded completely certain of something nobody had ever asked me about. That evening, I called my daughter Rachel. Rachel Mercer was a real estate attorney in Austin. Unlike me, she actually enjoyed reading property documents. "Quick question," I said. "That usually means a complicated question. I inherited 800 acres. She laughed. "I know. I was at the funeral. There's a subdivision using the ranch road." The laughter stopped. "What kind of using?" "Every day." A pause followed. Then Rachel asked the question that mattered. "Do they have an easement?" "I don't know." "Then find out." Simple advice. Unfortunately, simple advice can create complicated problems. The following week, I drove into Silver Creek Estates. I wanted information, nothing more. The neighborhood looked exactly like every upscale development I'd ever seen. Fresh mulch, expensive trucks, golf carts, perfect lawns, the kind of place where homeowners measured property values in paint colors. People were friendly. That made everything stranger. A retired couple told me the road had always belonged to the community. A delivery driver said company maps listed it as the official entrance. A contractor claimed the HOA maintained the corridor. Everybody repeated the same story. Nobody questioned it. Eventually, I reached the clubhouse. Workers were directing landscaping crews near the entrance. Standing in the middle of them was Denise Holloway. The first thing I noticed was how comfortable she looked giving orders. The second thing I noticed was what happened when I introduced myself. "I'm Wyatt Mercer." For half a second, her expression changed. Only half a second. But I saw it. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. "You are Earl Mercer's son," she said immediately. I blinked. My father's name was Walter. For the first time, she looked caught off guard. Just briefly. Then she recovered. Of course. My mistake. Maybe. Maybe not. Something about the exchange bothered me. People make mistakes. But Denise seemed like the type who prepared for conversations before they happened. We talked for several minutes, mostly small talk. Then I asked a simple question. Who owns the entrance road? Her smile tightened. The community depends on it. That wasn't an answer, so I asked again. Who owns it? The road serves hundreds of residents. Another non-answer, interesting. I tried once more. Is there an easement? This time she folded her arms. Access issues were settled years ago. Again. No answer. Only deflection. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but every response followed the same pattern. Use. Dependence. Community needs. Convenience. Everything except ownership. When I finally returned to my truck, one thing had become clear. Denise wasn't confused. She was careful. Very careful. And careful people usually have something worth protecting. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The ranch house felt quieter than it used to. Nora had been gone nearly 5 years, but some evenings the silence still hit harder than others. Her photograph sat beside the lamp, the same picture I'd carried through 3 different houses. I looked at it while reviewing old property folders. What am I missing? I asked nobody. The answer wasn't there yet. Not in the deeds, not in the tax records, not in the survey maps. But for the first time, I was certain there was an answer. Because Denise Holloway had already known who I was before we met. And people don't prepare for conversations unless they're worried about what might be said. The question wasn't whether something was wrong. The question was how long everyone had been hiding it. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped looking at the road as a shortcut and started looking at it as evidence. Every morning I parked near the ranch entrance with a notebook and a thermos of coffee. Every morning the same thing happened. Traffic flowed through my property like water through an open channel. Delivery trucks, school traffic, landscaping companies, HVAC contractors, utility crews. Nobody hesitated. Nobody checked a map. Nobody treated the road like private property. That wasn't arrogance. It was conditioning. Someone had spent years teaching people this road belonged to them. The more I watched, the more deliberate it looked. One afternoon, I noticed a landscaping crew spreading fresh mulch around cedar trees growing entirely inside ranch boundaries. The workers weren't trying to trespass. They honestly believed they were maintaining HOA property. I walked over. Who hired you? The foreman pointed toward Silver Creek Estates. The HOA. You know this land belongs to me? His expression changed instantly. No, sir. He looked genuinely surprised. We were told this entire entrance corridor belongs to the neighborhood. There was that phrase again. Entrance corridor. Not ranch road. Not private property. Not Mercer Ranch. Someone had spent years changing the language, and language has a funny way of changing what people believe. The next surprise came 3 days later. I was replacing a damaged fence post near the road when a delivery driver pulled over. He stepped out, carrying a package. Can you help me? I pointed toward the address. You're looking for Silver Creek. GPS says I'm already in Silver Creek. He held up his phone. The navigation screen showed the road highlighted as a community access route. Not private property, not ranch land. Community access. I stared at the screen. Then I took a picture of it. That image would matter later. Very much later. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. Near the subdivision entrance stood decorative stone markers displaying the Silver Creek logo. At first glance, they looked normal. Then I noticed where they were located. Not on HOA land. Not on subdivision property. On my side of the property line. The markers had been standing there for years. Apparently nobody had ever questioned them, including me. I called Rachel. Again. You were right. That's becoming a habit. I laughed. People honestly think the road belongs to the HOA. Do they have documents? Not that I've seen. Then they have assumptions. That answer stuck with me, because assumptions can become dangerous when enough people repeat them. A week later, I attended a neighborhood coffee event advertised on the community website. I didn't announce who I was. I just listened. Residents talked about schools, property values, retirement plans, home improvements, normal conversations. Then the subject of the entrance road came up. A couple who had moved into Silver Creek less than a year earlier explained why they bought their house for her. The private entrance was one of the biggest selling points. I looked up. What private entrance? The ranch road. The husband smiled. Our realtor said access was permanent. Permanent. That word landed hard, because nobody had shown me a single document proving permanence. Yet somehow homeowners were making six-figure investment decisions based on it. As the conversation continued, I heard the same story again and again. Residents believed the road belonged to the community, not because they'd researched it, because somebody had told them, repeatedly, for years. When the gathering ended, I walked back toward my truck. Halfway across the parking lot, I heard a familiar voice. Enjoying yourself? Denise Holloway. She was standing beside a golf cart with her usual polished smile. The smile never reached her eyes. I'm learning a lot. I'm sure you are. I studied her for a moment, then decided to ask directly. Who told homeowners the road was permanent? The smile disappeared. Only briefly. But it disappeared. People understand the value of community infrastructure. Another non-answer. I was getting tired of those. That's not what I asked. Denise crossed her arms. Mr. Mercer, you're creating a problem where none exists. No. I shook my head. I think somebody else created the problem years ago. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Not angry, not defensive. Uncomfortable. Then she recovered. As long as residents have access, nobody's concerned. That statement bothered me long after I drove home, because it revealed exactly how Denise viewed the situation. Access mattered. Ownership didn't. Convenience mattered. Documentation didn't. But property law doesn't work that way, and eventually reality catches up to convenience. That evening I spread maps across my dining room table, survey copies, tax records, property plats, everything I could find. I wasn't trying to prove ownership anymore. I already suspected the answer. Now I was trying to understand something else. How had an entire neighborhood come to believe a story nobody seemed able to document? Then my phone rang. Rachel, you still looking into the road? Every day. Good. Her voice sounded serious. Because I found something. I sat forward. What? A reference in an old county filing. My pulse quickened. What kind of reference? There was a pause. Then Rachel said 4 words that instantly changed everything. Temporary construction access agreement. The room went silent. Because if that phrase meant what I thought it meant, the entire story Silver Creek had been telling for 8 years might be built on something that was never supposed to last in the first place. The next morning, Rachel emailed me a copy of the county filing she'd found. I read it twice, then a third time. The language was dry, technical, and buried inside development paperwork most people would never bother reading. But one phrase stood out. Temporary construction access. Not permanent access. Not community access. Not homeowner access. Construction access. Temporary. That single word changed the entire picture. I called Rachel immediately. You sure this is the same road? Positive. What happens if there was never a permanent easement? She didn't hesitate. Then somebody has a problem. I looked out the kitchen window toward the ranch entrance. A steady stream of vehicles was already moving through. The problem was bigger than I thought, because hundreds of people were relying on something that might never have legally existed. 3 days later, the conflict stopped being theoretical. I found the certified letter in my mailbox. The envelope carried the Silver Creek Estates HOA logo. That alone made me laugh. The contents didn't. Inside was a formal violation notice. According to the HOA, a livestock gate I'd recently installed near the ranch entrance violated community access standards. They demanded corrective action within 14 days and included a fine. $750. I stared at the number, then at the property description, then back at the number. The gate sat entirely on my land, not near HOA property, not touching HOA property. My land, my gate, my fine. I picked up the phone. Denise answered on the second ring. Silver Creek Estates, I got your letter. A pause. Then her voice became noticeably colder. Good. You fined me for a gate on my ranch. The board approved enforcement action. I leaned back in my chair. Why is the HOA regulating property it doesn't own? Another pause. Then came the familiar pattern. The entrance corridor affects the entire community. I almost smiled. There it was again. The phrase, entrance corridor, never ownership, never easement, never legal authority, just community impact. I'd like a copy of the easement. Silence. A longer silence this time. Finally, she answered. The community has used that road for years. That's not what I asked. The board has already reviewed the matter. That's not what I asked either. Her patience disappeared. Mr. Mercer, your father understood how things worked. That got my attention. Immediately. Because Denise had never met my father. At least not officially. Yet she kept referring to him. Past tense. Like she'd been part of conversations nobody ever told me about. I lowered my voice. Did my father ever grant a permanent easement? No answer. Just breathing. Then the line went dead. She hung up. That told me more than anything she could have said. The following morning, I drove toward the entrance and found 2 contractors digging post holes. Brand new Silver Creek Estates signs lay on the ground beside them. They were installing HOA signage inside my property line. I parked and walked over. One worker waved. Morning. Who told you to put those there? The HOA office. He pointed toward orange survey paint on the ground. They marked everything last week. I looked down. Fresh paint. Fresh measurements. Someone had planned this carefully, which meant the signs weren't a mistake. They were a statement. Silver Creek was acting like ownership had already been settled. I called Denise again. This time she sounded irritated before I even finished speaking. Your contractors are installing HOA signs on my property. The entrance identifies the community. The entrance is my ranch. Residents recognize it as part of Silver Creek. Recognition, use, dependence, community. Every word except ownership, every conversation ended the same way. By then, I wasn't frustrated. I was curious. Because people only avoid direct answers when direct answers hurt them. 2 days later, another surprise arrived. A county deputy pulled into my driveway. Professional, polite, calm. Exactly the kind of law enforcement officer you want showing up unexpectedly. "Mr. Mercer?" "That's me. We received a complaint." I already knew where this was going. "About the gate?" He nodded. "Alleged obstruction of community infrastructure." The phrase was so ridiculous I almost laughed. Infrastructure. Like my ranch road had somehow become public property without anyone telling me. The deputy spent 20 minutes reviewing maps and listening to both sides. Eventually, he handed the paperwork back. "I'm not making a determination today." "Fair enough, but you may want to resolve this before it escalates." There it was, the first real warning, not about ownership, about conflict, because conflict creates lawsuits, and lawsuits create attention. As the deputy drove away, I noticed Denise's SUV parked farther down the road. Watching, waiting, calculating. She wasn't trying to solve the problem. She was trying to control it. That evening, I spread every document I'd collected across my dining room table. The temporary access filing, survey maps, tax records, property descriptions. Rachel joined me through a video call. For nearly 2 hours, we compared records, looking for something definitive, looking for the missing piece. Eventually, Rachel leaned closer to her screen. "There's something we're not seeing." "What?" If the access was temporary, somebody had to know. The room went quiet. Because she was right. Developers, lawyers, county planners, HOA leadership. Someone knew exactly what kind of agreement existed, and if they knew, then somebody had spent years pretending it was something else. I looked down at the growing stack of paperwork. For the first time, this no longer felt like a property dispute. It felt like a paper trail. And somewhere inside that paper trail was the reason Denise Holloway refused to show me a single easement document. The question wasn't whether she was hiding something anymore. The question was how much. The next Saturday, Rachel drove out from Austin with 3 banker boxes, a laptop, and the kind of determination that made opposing attorneys nervous. She walked into the ranch house, looked at the mountain of paperwork covering my dining room table, and nodded. "Good." "Good? You haven't thrown anything away." That was my father's influence. Walter Mercer never trusted memory when paper would do. If he repaired a fence, there was a receipt. If he sold cattle, there was a ledger. If someone made a promise, he wrote it down. By noon, Rachel and I had transformed the dining room into a temporary records office. Property surveys, tax assessments, county filings, old correspondence. Decades of documents stretched across every available surface. For hours, we followed one trail after another. Most led nowhere. Some revealed minor details. A few raised more questions than answers. Then Rachel found something. "Look at this." She slid a yellowing letter across the table. The document was nearly 10 years old. The sender was the original developer of Silver Creek Estates. The recipient was my father. The subject line caught my attention immediately. "Proposed access agreement." I sat down. Slowly. The letter outlined negotiations regarding temporary roadway use during subdivision construction. Temporary. There was that word again. The developer wanted construction vehicles to cross ranch property while building the neighborhood. In exchange, they offered road maintenance and repair services. The agreement lasted 18 months. No more, no less. The terms were clear. Construction access, not permanent access. Not homeowner access. Construction access. My pulse quickened, because this wasn't a county reference anymore. This was direct evidence. Rachel kept reading. Then she stopped. What? She handed me another document clipped behind the first. It was my father's response. Short, direct, professional. The developer had asked about purchasing a permanent easement. My father declined, twice. Then declined again after a revised offer. No ambiguity, no confusion, no negotiation. Just no. I leaned back in my chair, so he never agreed. Rachel shook her head. Not even close. For the first time, the foundation beneath Silver Creek's story started cracking. Because if my father rejected a permanent easement, then somebody had built an entire community around access they never actually secured. The next breakthrough came from an old filing cabinet in my father's workshop. The cabinet sat beneath a workbench covered in dust and rusted hardware. I'd seen it 100 times growing up. Never paid attention. Inside were folders organized with almost military precision. Water rights, fence disputes, grazing leases, mineral records. Then I found one labeled Access Road. I looked at Rachel. She looked at me. Neither of us spoke. We already knew this mattered. The folder was thick, very thick. Inside were years of correspondence, letters, engineering sketches, survey notes, meeting summaries, copies of legal reviews. Someone had spent considerable time discussing that road. The deeper we dug, the stranger things became. Several engineering reports described alternate entrance options for the future subdivision. One proposed a northern route. Another outlined a bridge crossing. A third recommended a completely separate access corridor. Every report reached the same conclusion. Alternative access was possible. Expensive, but possible. The developer hadn't lacked options. They'd simply chosen the cheapest one. My road. Then Rachel found another document. This one wasn't from the developer. It came from a consulting firm hired during planning. The report discussed long-term access risks. I skimmed the summary, then read it again. The consultant specifically warned that reliance on temporary ranch access could create future ownership disputes. The warning wasn't hidden. It wasn't vague. It was written in plain English. Someone knew years before the first homeowner moved in. Someone knew. The room fell silent. Rachel slowly closed the file. They were warned. I nodded. The significance settled over both of us at the same time. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a paperwork mistake. It wasn't an accident. At some point, somebody made a decision, a conscious decision. Move forward now. Deal with the access problem later. And now later had arrived. That evening, I drove past Silver Creek Estates. Not to confront anyone, just to look. Families were walking dogs. Kids rode bicycles. People watered flower beds. Normal lives. Normal people. Most of them had no idea what existed inside the folder sitting on my dining room table. Most genuinely believed everything had been handled years ago, which meant they weren't the ones who worried me. The people who worried me were the ones who had seen these documents before, the ones who knew the difference between temporary access and permanent rights, the ones who understood exactly how fragile the situation really was. When I returned home, Rachel was still reviewing files. She looked up as I walked in. I think we're getting close. To what? The reason Denise knew who you were. That stopped me. Because she was right. The access issue explained the road, but it didn't explain Denise. Not entirely. She'd recognized my name immediately. She'd avoided every ownership question. She'd reacted to my father's name like it carried history, which meant there was still a piece missing, a piece hidden somewhere inside years of records. And judging by the growing pile of documents on my table, we were finally getting close enough to make somebody nervous. Very nervous. The breakthrough came the following afternoon. Rachel was still working through the access road folder when she suddenly stopped turning pages. Wyatt. Her tone was different. Not excited. Focused. I walked over. What did you find? She slid a document across the table. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Just another engineering report from the early development phase. Then I noticed the heading. Alternative Access Evaluation. I sat down. The report outlined 3 separate entrance options for what would eventually become Silver Creek Estates. Route A crossed county-owned land. Route B required a small bridge over a drainage channel. Route C connected directly to a state-maintained roadway less than a mile north of the subdivision. All 3 were viable. All 3 had been professionally reviewed. All 3 avoided my ranch completely. I looked up. Then why didn't they build one? Rachel tapped a paragraph near the bottom. Estimated construction costs. There was the answer. Every alternative was significantly more expensive than using my family's road. The developer hadn't been trapped. They hadn't run out of options. They'd chosen the cheapest path available, temporary access through Mercer Ranch, then hoped nobody would force the issue later. Unfortunately for them, later had arrived. The deeper we dug, the worse it became. Buried beneath the engineering reports sat a stack of correspondence between the developer and my father. The pattern was impossible to miss. Request. Rejection. Counteroffer. Rejection. Higher offer. Rejection. My father never wavered. He refused every attempt to purchase permanent access. At one point, the developer offered a 6-figure payment. My father still said no. Attached to one of the letters was a handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Never sell leverage. Once access is permanent, control is gone forever. I stared at the words for a long moment. Walter Mercer had seen the problem years before anyone else, and he'd documented it. The next document hit even harder. An attorney hired by the developer summarized negotiations after another rejected easement proposal. The memo stated, landowner remains unwilling to convey permanent access rights. Alternative solutions should continue to be evaluated. Alternative solutions, not future negotiations, not eventual ownership. Alternative solutions, because even their own legal team knew the road didn't belong to them. Rachel leaned back in her chair. They knew. I nodded. Every one of them. Developer, lawyers, planners, people making decisions at the highest level. None of them believed permanent access existed. Yet somehow hundreds of homeowners eventually did, which meant the truth had been lost somewhere between planning documents and reality. Or maybe it hadn't been lost at all. Maybe it had simply been ignored. That evening, I drove to the county records office. A small brick building that looked exactly like it had 20 years earlier. Inside, old property records filled shelves from floor to ceiling. The clerk on duty helped me pull archived filings connected to Silver Creek's original development. Hours passed. Maps, applications, engineering reviews, meeting notes. Then I found something that made me sit up straight. The final subdivision approval. I read every page carefully. Nowhere did it grant permanent access through Mercer Ranch. Nowhere did it establish a recorded easement. Nowhere did ownership change. The county approved the subdivision itself, not the road. Legally, the road remained exactly what it had always been. Private property. I made copies of everything. When I returned home, Rachel was waiting. So? I dropped the stack of records onto the table. No easement. No transfer? No transfer. No county approval? Nothing. For the first time since this started, we weren't dealing with suspicions. We had proof. The kind that survives arguments. The kind that survives opinions. The kind that survives courtrooms. But one question still bothered me. If the documents were this clear, why had nobody challenged Silver Creek before now? The answer arrived 2 days later, by accident. I was fueling my truck at a convenience store outside town when an older man approached me. Retired rancher, weathered face, firm handshake. He introduced himself and asked a simple question. "You're Walter Mercer's boy, right?" I nodded. The man glanced around before lowering his voice. "Your dad talked about that subdivision years ago. That got my attention." "What did he say?" The rancher chuckled. He figured somebody down the road would end up fighting over access. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Did he ever say why he didn't push the issue? The man looked toward the highway, then back at me. "Because your mother got sick." The answer hit harder than I expected. Of course, during those years my father had been caring for my mother through her final illness. Court fights, property disputes, development battles. None of that mattered compared to family. The developer got lucky, not because they were right, because life happened. And when my father passed away years later, nobody revisited the issue. The assumptions simply continued, year after year, until they became accepted truth. I drove home thinking about that. Thinking about how fragile the entire situation really was. Because everything Silver Creek believed rested on one thing. Not ownership, not documentation, not legal rights. Assumption. And assumptions have a habit of collapsing the moment somebody opens the right file cabinet. The documents now sitting on my dining room table had already changed the story. The only question left was how the people inside Silver Creek would react when they finally learned the truth. And something told me that day was getting very close. The first sign appeared in my mailbox. Not a certified letter. Not another HOA notice. A plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 3 words were typed across the center. Check board records, nothing else. No signature, no explanation. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I called Rachel. Her response was immediate. "Someone's talking." That's what I thought, which means someone is worried. That was the interesting part. For months, every conversation had been one-sided. Denise gave orders. The board issued notices. Residents accepted explanations. Now someone inside Silver Creek was quietly pointing us toward information. That meant the pressure was spreading. 2 days later, Rachel filed a formal records request related to early development filings and HOA transition documents. Everything legal. Everything documented. No accusations, just requests. The response came faster than expected. Too fast. Several files arrived within 48 hours. Most were routine. Budget reports, meeting minutes, maintenance contracts. Then Rachel found something buried in an archive packet. A memorandum, 7 years old, prepared during the transition between the original developer and the HOA board. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The document discussed long-term access concerns. One paragraph had been highlighted by somebody years ago. If permanent roadway rights are not secured prior to project completion, future legal exposure may exist for successor entities and homeowners. I looked up. Rachel was already staring at me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The meaning was obvious. Someone knew years before the first homeowner moved in. Years before Denise became HOA president. Years before residents started believing the road belonged to them. Somebody knew there was no permanent access, and they moved forward anyway. The document changed everything. Because ignorance is one thing, knowledge is another. This wasn't a hidden problem nobody could have predicted. It had been predicted. In writing. The following week brought another surprise. My phone rang just after sunset. Unknown number. Normally I ignored those. This time I answered. Mr. Mercer? The voice sounded nervous. Speaking. My name is Harold Simmons. I recognized the name immediately. Retired engineer. Longtime Silver Creek resident. I'd met him briefly at the community coffee event. You got a minute? Something in his tone made me sit down. Sure. Harold lowered his voice. I probably shouldn't be calling. That got my attention. Why? Because the board's having emergency meetings. I remained silent. People reveal more when you let them talk. Harold continued. Your name comes up constantly. Mine? Every meeting. Interesting. Why? A short pause followed. Then came the answer. They know you've found documents. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Not because the statement surprised me, because it confirmed what I'd suspected. Denise wasn't reacting to rumors. She was reacting to evidence. What kind of meetings? I asked. The kind where people stop talking when someone enters the room. That wasn't good. For them. Harold explained that questions had started appearing during board discussions. Some residents had heard rumors about surveys. Others were asking why nobody could produce an easement. A few had begun requesting access records. The board's answers were becoming increasingly defensive, and Denise was becoming increasingly angry. That interested me. Angry people make mistakes. Confident people stay calm. Fear usually sounds like anger. What else? I asked. Harold hesitated. Then he said something that stuck with me. Some board members think this should have been disclosed years ago. I leaned forward. Disclosed? The access situation. There it was. Not ownership. Not property rights. The situation. Even the people inside the HOA leadership apparently knew there was a situation. That alone told me plenty. After the call ended, I sat at the dining room table staring at the memorandum. The warning had existed for years. The developer knew, consultants knew, lawyers knew. Apparently some board members knew. The only people who didn't know were the homeowners. The people paying HOA dues. The people buying houses. The people making financial decisions based on information they'd been given. That realization changed the emotional weight of the fight. This was never really about me. Not anymore. The residents weren't my opponents. Most had been handed a story and trusted it. The real conflict sat somewhere higher, somewhere inside years of decisions that nobody wanted examined too closely. The next morning, Rachel and I prepared a formal notice. Professional, detailed, supported by documents. We included survey references, county records, the temporary access agreement, the rejected easement negotiations, everything. Then we sent copies to the HOA board. No threats, No demands, just facts. The response was immediate. Silence. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Nothing. No email, no phone call, no letter, no denial, no explanation. Just silence. And silence can be very revealing, because people with strong evidence usually answer questions. People without it often hope the questions disappear. By the end of the week, Harold called again. This time his voice sounded even more uneasy. They're scheduling an emergency community meeting. I looked at the stack of documents beside me, the surveys, the memos, the correspondence, the warning they'd ignored. And for the first time since this started, I realized the battle was about to move out of file cabinets and into public view. Because once homeowners started asking questions in a room full of witnesses, Denise Holloway wouldn't be able to change the subject anymore. She'd have to provide answers. And judging by everything we'd found so far, answers were the one thing she didn't want to give. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the Silver Creek Clubhouse. By the time Rachel and I arrived, the parking lot was overflowing. Pickup trucks lined the curb. Golf carts filled every available space. Homeowners stood in small groups, talking quietly. Nobody looked relaxed. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. Now people wanted facts. Inside, every chair was occupied. Residents stood along the walls and crowded the hallways. At the front of the room sat Denise Holloway, 3 board members, and the HOA attorney. A projector screen displayed the Silver Creek logo. The setup looked polished, professional, carefully controlled. At least that was the plan. Rachel and I took seats near the back. A few rows ahead sat Harold Simmons. When he noticed us, he gave a slight nod. The meeting started exactly at 7. Denise stood and smiled, the same smile she'd worn every time I saw her. Confident, measured, calculated. For nearly 20 minutes, she spoke about community stability, property values, neighborhood harmony, infrastructure planning, future growth. The words flowed smoothly. But I noticed something important. She never once said the HOA owned the road. Not once. Rachel noticed too. She scribbled something on her notepad and slid it toward me. No ownership claim. Exactly. Denise was avoiding the one statement that could be challenged directly. Eventually, she opened the floor to questions. That was the moment everything changed. An older homeowner stood up. I recognized him from one of the coffee gatherings. His name was Frank Keller. Retired firefighter. Straightforward guy. "Do we own the entrance road?" The room immediately went silent. Denise smiled carefully. "The community has relied on that roadway for many years." Frank didn't sit down. "That's not what I asked." Several heads nodded. Denise's smile tightened. "The road serves all residents." Still not an answer. People noticed. A woman near the front stood up next. "Is there an easement?" Another resident joined in. "Has there ever been an easement?" Then another. "Why can't anyone produce the paperwork?" The questions started arriving faster. The atmosphere shifted. People weren't angry yet. They were curious. And curiosity is dangerous when somebody's been hiding information. The HOA attorney leaned toward Denise and whispered something. She nodded, then announced that ownership matters were complex and required legal review. The room didn't like that answer, because complexity wasn't what residents wanted. They wanted yes or no. Then Harold Simmons stood. The room quieted immediately. Harold had lived there longer than almost anyone. "What exactly are we reviewing?" Denise hesitated. "Just for a second." But everyone saw it. Harold continued. Because homeowners are hearing rumors about temporary access agreements. That landed like a hammer. Several residents exchanged surprised looks. Others pulled out phones. The attorney's expression darkened. Denise attempted to regain control. There's a great deal of misinformation circulating. Rachel slowly stood up. The timing couldn't have been better. Then perhaps documents would help. Every head turned. Denise looked like she'd swallowed a nail. The board attorney immediately objected. This isn't a formal proceeding. Rachel remained calm. No. But homeowners deserve accurate information. A murmur spread through the room. Homeowners agreed. The board could feel it. Pressure was building. Fast. Rachel walked to the front carrying a folder. Inside were county records, survey maps, the temporary construction agreement, copies of correspondence. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. The kind facts that don't care who dislikes them. One by one, she explained what we'd discovered. Temporary access, rejected easement requests, alternative entrance options, county filings. Every document pointed in the same direction. The road remained private ranch property, every inch of it. The room grew quieter with each page. Questions turned into concern. Concern turned into suspicion. For the first time all evening, residents weren't looking at me. They were looking at Denise. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Then Ben Foster arrived, the surveyor. He carried a large tube beneath one arm. Without saying much, he rolled a detailed survey map across a table near the projector. Bright property lines, GPS coordinates, boundary markers. Simple, clear, impossible to misunderstand. The road sat entirely inside Mercer Ranch. Not partially. Entirely. A homeowner near the front stared at the map. You're saying none of this belongs to Silver Creek? Ben answered calmly. That's exactly what the survey shows. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument, because evidence had entered the room, and evidence doesn't negotiate. Denise tried steering the conversation back toward community reliance, emergency services, neighborhood needs, property values. But something had changed. Residents weren't interested in slogans anymore. They wanted documents, and the documents weren't helping her. As the meeting stretched past 2 hours, the questions became sharper, more direct, more difficult. Board members stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. The attorney spent most of his time whispering, and Denise looked increasingly cornered. Then a resident near the front raised his hand. He was holding something, an old folder. A very old folder. I found this while cleaning my garage. The room watched. He slowly removed a faded marketing brochure from the subdivision's early sales days, and suddenly Rachel sat forward in her chair, because whatever was inside that brochure might explain everything. The homeowner carried it to the front of the room like it was something fragile. In a way, it was. 8 years of assumptions were hanging by a thread, and that faded piece of paper looked capable of cutting it. He handed it to Rachel. She opened it carefully. The brochure was one of the original marketing packets used when Silver Creek Estates first launched. Glossy photographs, happy families, walking trails, community amenities, the usual promises developers love to make. Then Rachel stopped turning pages. She found something. I could tell by the look on her face. "What is it?" someone asked. Rachel held up the brochure so the room could see. Then she read a single sentence out loud. "Exclusive private entrance serving Silver Creek Estates through scenic ranch property." The room went silent. Not because the sentence sounded dramatic, because it sounded permanent. And everyone knew it. A homeowner near the back stood up. "That's exactly what our realtor showed us." Another voice answered immediately. Mine too. Then another. And ours. Suddenly people weren't talking to the board anymore. They were talking to each other. Comparing memories. Comparing sales presentations. Comparing promises. The atmosphere shifted again. This wasn't a property dispute anymore. It was becoming a trust issue. Rachel continued reviewing the packet. A second brochure contained nearly identical language, then a third. Each one reinforced the same message. Permanent access. Private entrance. Exclusive community roadway. Not one brochure mentioned temporary construction access. Not one mentioned rejected easement negotiations. Not one mentioned that the road belonged to someone else. The omissions mattered. A lot. The HOA attorney requested the documents. Rachel handed them over. He reviewed them quietly. The longer he read, the less comfortable he looked. Denise noticed. That made her nervous too. A resident in the front row raised his hand. If these brochures weren't accurate, who approved them? Nobody answered. Another resident followed immediately. Did the board know? Still no answer. The questions became sharper. Was this disclosed when homes were sold? Why weren't homeowners informed? Who knew about the access agreement? For the first time all evening, Denise looked genuinely trapped. Every answer created another problem. Every silence created suspicion. The attorney leaned toward her and whispered something. She nodded, then attempted a response. The current board was not involved in the original development process. Technically true, but nobody seemed satisfied. Because the issue wasn't who created the problem. The issue was who knew about it afterward. Then Rachel stood again. I think there's something else people should see. The room quieted instantly. She opened another folder. Inside was the memorandum we'd discovered earlier, the warning document, the one that changed everything. Rachel placed it beneath the projector camera. The text appeared on the large screen behind the board. Residents leaned forward. Some pulled out phones and zoomed in. Others simply stared. Then Rachel read the key paragraph. If permanent roadway rights are not secured prior to project completion, future legal exposure may exist for successor entities and homeowners. A wave of murmurs moved through the room. People understood exactly what they were seeing. Not speculation, not rumor, not opinion. A warning, written years earlier, before the first homeowner moved in. Someone knew. The realization hit the room all at once. Several residents began flipping through their own paperwork. Others demanded copies. A few looked visibly angry. Not at me, at the board, at the situation, at the possibility that they had never been given the full story. Harold Simmons slowly stood. The room quieted again. His voice was calm, measured. Does anyone here dispute that this warning existed? Nobody spoke. Does anyone dispute these brochures were distributed? Again, silence. Harold nodded. Then maybe the real question isn't ownership. He turned toward Denise. Maybe the real question is why nobody told homeowners. That landed harder than anything said all evening. Because everyone knew the answer mattered, and nobody seemed eager to provide it. One board member finally spoke, a younger man who had remained quiet for most of the meeting. We were told everything had already been handled. The statement slipped out before anyone could stop him. Several heads turned, including Denise's. The board member immediately realized his mistake. But it was too late. The admission was out there. Handled. Not resolved. Not documented. Handled. The distinction mattered. A lot. The meeting dissolved into questions after that. Not shouting. Not chaos. Just dozens of homeowners demanding explanations simultaneously. The board couldn't keep up. Neither could the attorney. The narrative they'd controlled for years was collapsing under its own weight. Eventually, the meeting adjourned without any formal resolution. People lingered in the parking lot long afterward, talking, comparing documents, making phone calls. As Rachel and I walked toward my truck, Harold caught up with us. "You know what happens now?" I looked at him. "What?" "People start digging." He glanced back toward the clubhouse, and once homeowners start digging, they're not going to stop. I knew he was right. The documents were public now. The questions were public now. And most importantly, the doubt was public now. The next phase wouldn't happen inside a clubhouse. It would happen in county offices, attorney meetings, records requests, formal proceedings, places where opinions matter less than paperwork. As Rachel climbed into the truck, she looked at me and smiled for the first time all evening. "The fight's over." I started the engine. No. I looked back at the clubhouse one last time. The argument's over. Because from this point forward, nobody would be debating what happened. The documents had already settled that. The only thing left was deciding what the consequences would be. And judging by the expressions on several homeowners' faces as they left the parking lot, those consequences were about to become very expensive. The weeks after the emergency meeting moved faster than anything that came before it. Homeowners started filing records requests. Attorneys started reviewing disclosures. County officials began examining documents that had been sitting in filing cabinets for years. The conversation was no longer about rumors. It was about records. And records are difficult to argue with. The first major shift came when the HOA hired outside legal counsel, not their usual attorney. A new firm, a more expensive firm. That alone told people plenty. Organizations don't spend that kind of money when everything is fine. They spend it when they're worried. Rachel and I continued supplying documentation whenever requested. Survey maps, county filings, the temporary construction agreement, the rejected easement proposals, the consultant warning memorandum. Every piece pointed to the same conclusion. The road belonged to Mercer Ranch, always had. Meanwhile, pressure inside Silver Creek kept growing. Harold called almost every week. Residents were demanding explanations. Board meetings were overflowing. Questions that once disappeared were now being asked publicly, again and again. Denise tried controlling the narrative. At first. Then she tried minimizing the issue. Then she stopped speaking publicly altogether. That was when I knew the situation had truly changed. People who believe they're right usually want attention. People losing control usually avoid it. The county hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning. Nothing about it felt dramatic. No courtroom, no jury, no television cameras. Just county officials, attorneys, engineers, survey maps, and property records. Real life tends to work that way. The biggest moments often happen in ordinary rooms. Rachel sat beside me. Across the room sat Denise and several board members. For the first time since I met her, Denise looked tired. Not angry, not confident. Tired. The hearing lasted several hours. Experts reviewed survey data. Engineers discussed alternate access routes. Attorneys reviewed recorded documents. Every question led back to the same fact. No permanent easement existed. No ownership transfer existed. No county record granted Silver Creek rights to the road. The evidence wasn't close. It wasn't complicated. It was clear. When the hearing concluded, the county confirmed what the documents had shown all along. The HOA could not claim ownership of the roadway. Any future access would require lawful agreements negotiated between willing parties. Nothing more. Nothing less. Facts 1. Afterwards, something unexpected happened. The residents didn't turn on each other. They turned toward solutions. A committee formed to evaluate alternative entrances. Engineers updated old plans. Cost estimates were revised. Meetings shifted from blame to construction. People finally started addressing the problem that should have been addressed years earlier. The solution wasn't cheap, not even close. The new access route would cost several $1 million. Roadwork, drainage improvements, utility relocation, permits, engineering, everything the original developer avoided paying for. Now the bill had arrived, and there was no shortcut left. A month later, Denise Holloway resigned. No speech, no public defense, no dramatic farewell. Just a short statement announcing her departure from the board. A special election followed. New leadership took over. One of their first actions was increasing transparency requirements and opening access to records. Funny how popular transparency becomes after secrecy fails. During construction, the new board approached me with a proposal. Temporary emergency access only. Fully documented. Attorney reviewed. County approved. Every responsibility clearly defined. Every condition written down. No assumptions. No misunderstandings. No vague promises. I agreed. Not because I owed anyone anything. Because most of the residents had never been the problem. They'd trusted information they believed was accurate. The real lesson belonged elsewhere. 9 months later, construction crews finished the new entrance. For the first time in Silver Creek's history, the neighborhood had its own legal roadway. Permanent, recorded, undisputed. Exactly what should have existed from the beginning. The evening it opened, I drove down the old ranch road one final time. The same road that started everything. The same road that had carried years of assumptions. The same road that nearly became somebody else's property simply because nobody challenged the story. I stopped near the entrance. The old wooden sign my father installed decades earlier still stood beside the fence. Weathered, faded, but standing. I cleaned it up, reset the post, and hung a freshly painted board beneath it. The words were simple. Private ranch roads. First he stepped back and looked at it, then looked down the road stretching across the ranch. Quiet now. The traffic was gone. The arguments were gone. The assumptions were gone. All that remained was the truth. Looking back, the strangest part of the entire fight wasn't the HOA. It wasn't the meetings. It wasn't even the legal battle. It was how many people believed something simply because they'd heard it repeated long enough. But ownership doesn't come from repetition. It doesn't come from convenience. It doesn't come from community belief. Ownership comes from records, from boundaries, from documentation. My father understood that. Rachel understood that. Eventually, the county understood that too.
And in the end, the gates never chopped the neighborhood. The truth is, if there's one lesson I take from this story, is that assumption can last for years, but sooner or later, reality catch up. The people in Silver Creek wasn't stopped by a lucky gate. They were stopped by a problem that should have been addressed long before anyone bought a home there. A road can be used every day. Talk about a brochure and treat it like it belongs to everyone, but ownership still comes down to what the records say. That's why it's matter to ask questions, keep good documentation, and never assume that convenience and legality are the same thing. There's also something worth remembering about standing your ground. You don't always need the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes patience, fast, and persistence carry more weight than arguments ever could. In the end, what mattered wasn't winning against someone else. What mattered was protecting what was rightful there and finding a lawful path forward for everyone involved. I'd love to hear what you think. If you believe Wyatt handled the situation right way, Type yes in the comments, and if you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where paperwork talk a different story than people did, share your experience below. I read a lot of your comments, and they're often just as interesting as the story themselves. And if you enjoy this story about ranch life, property pride, perseverance, and quiet determination, consider subscribing. There's plenty more story ahead. I'd be glad to help you along for the ride.